You can come in here anytime, Jerry. Oh.
Go.
Hello? What? Mhm. He did very well.
It's his firm, I guess, isn't it? This is what I do when it's just. If people could find a seat, we'll begin in just a minute. Hey, Gary, I slid your laptop off to the side while Sam was doing stuff, but it's still there, open. So you'll slide it back over.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Barth, Beth Shalom president, and I would like to welcome everyone to our 11th Nelson Legacy event. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We were last able to hold this program 3 years ago, and it is great to be back. I would like to thank Rabbi David and Alicia Nelson, along with the entire Nelson family. I would also like to thank our many sponsors and volunteers who are making tonight's program and tomorrow's Lunch and Learn possible. Harry, I know it's been a long time, but it is really wonderful to have you with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Gamer.
Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to be here in person for the Nelson Legacy event. It is wonderful to be back. Everybody here knows Harry, I believe, but to do the formalities of this, Harry is author of best-selling books, The United States of Opioids, A Prescription for Liberating a Nation in Pain, which is, I believe, on the screen. And he's also author of From Obamacare to Trump Care, Why You Should Care. He's the founding partner. I like your titles. It's good choices. He's the founding partner of Nelson Hardiman, a leading healthcare life sciences firm in Los Angeles, and has received national recognition for his efforts to change the conversation around America's overlapping overdose, addiction, pain, and mental health crises, and to drive legal changes to improve access, quality, and safety of behavioral health care, including the Behavioral Health Network's Addiction Advocacy Award and the Davis Direction Foundation Award and the Spirit Award from Claire Matrix. It's my honor to introduce Harry.
Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I've spoken on this material a lot, but tonight is really is very special for me. It's bizarre for me to be standing at a podium where I watched my father speak in this shul for many years, and it's so I feel some trepidation about being up here. But I want to say a deep thank you to this congregation, to Rabbi Gamer, to all of you for coming out and for having this event tonight. It's a tremendous honor. I want to thank my sister Riva for coming into town. I think she's the only person besides me who traveled from out of state to be here, so I want to thank her. I wanted to do a couple things tonight. I'm very mindful when I sit up here that every time, one of the lessons I've learned that I've taken with me my whole life and my whole professional career is that my father was always telling people when to start timing him. And so I'm actually going to do the same. And if you're timing me, I'm going to try to be done by about 8:15 so that we can have time for questions. That's just I can't be in Beth Shalom without thinking of my father setting the time. Let me just tell you what I want to do tonight. My goal tonight is, first, I do want to say a word about Nelson Legacy because the name of this event speaks very personally to me. I want to share a little bit about why I wrote this book. It's not obvious that somebody who's a lawyer, who's not a academic or a journalist would write a book. So I want to just share what was bothering me and why I wrote it. I hope it will resonate. I want to talk about what's going on about the crisis, thinking about the crisis on 3 different levels. There's we hear a lot about the crisis right in front of us and a lot of immediacy. The Detroit Free Press had an article this morning about a new progress in Michigan and federally to get the drug naloxone, Narcan out there to prevent overdoses. I want to talk about that immediate level of the crisis, but I feel like a lot of the conversation that we hear and get from the media, from movies like Dope Sick, is already conveying a lot of that. What I'm hoping to do is really 2 things: to take it to a more of a systemic level, which is sort of what really strikes me about how this is a manifestation of a bigger problem in our healthcare, and then to the level of what's going on in our society. I've been accused of trying to connect too many things here, but I'm interested to share this, and I hope it will lead not to it's a dark topic to talk about, right? Overdose deaths is not a happy topic, the topics that my dad inspired with sermons for years and what you came to shul for, but I actually think there is a hopeful message, and I kind of want to end off with where we go from here. So I want to say a word about Nelson Legacy. First of all, it's funny, I did not, a lot of people may know my father went to law school for at least a year or 2 before he went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. His father went to law school also before becoming a rabbi. And there was a lot of jokes. My whole life, there were a lot of jokes about once I finished law school, was I ready to go to JTS and take on and be a 3rd generation, like my cousin Abby, who I think is watching, or I know her siblings are watching tonight in New York. So I didn't do that. But what I found my whole life is that there is a legacy to being my parents' son and to being my grandfather, Harry Nelson, whose namesake I am, to being his grandson. And that is one of not being able to sit still and seeing every problem as a responsibility to step up and try to do something. And this whole talk and this topic for me was very much about that. And I'm humbled to be able to share this tonight, and really of all the great blessings in my life, aside from my children and my wife, Dorit, being my parents' son. I know Reva joins me and Deborah joined me in thinking that there could not be a better honor and a greater thing than to be your children and to carry on the legacy of the work that you have that you carried on from your parents. So, all right. So with that, let me just jump into the topic. So the way I got involved in this topic initially was about 20 years ago. I had just moved to California. I'd been doing healthcare work for like hospitals and health systems for academic medical centers in Chicago. And I got to Los Angeles and I started working with doctors who were getting in trouble with the medical board and the state DEA for, in some cases, for prescribing pain medication, in other cases for being addicted to pain medication. It was a problem that was getting much, much worse in the early 2000s, particularly with drugs like pharmaceutical grade fentanyl. These drugs were highly, highly addictive. So I was working with doctors who were getting addicted and doctors who were getting in trouble for prescribing them to patients, for overprescribing. And so there were 2 aspects of this work that really were transformative for me. One was working with doctors who were getting in trouble for prescribing. I'm sort of always interested in reverse engineering from a problem into a solution. And I started working through and saying, okay, if this is what gets a doctor into trouble, how can I tell other doctors what not to do? I do that throughout all my work with nursing homes, with hospitals, with pharmacies and labs. But in this case, what I started to see was every couple of years, the ball kept moving, right? The standard of what doctors needed to do kept changing. The compliance standards every couple of years were radically different. And what that told me was that something was happening. We did not have an understanding as a country, as a healthcare system, about what the rules were supposed to be. And they kept changing, and doctors were an easy punching bag, along with Purdue Pharma and pharmaceuticals, which I'll talk about. And so that started to bother me. The other thing I noticed was, as I started working with doctors who themselves were becoming addicted, the work of these people who had become addicted and in many cases lost everything, lost their licenses, lost families, and had to rebuild from nothing, really forced me to do some serious introspection, because I found that becoming an ally to people in recovery, to the work, I learned so much about what it means to be honest with yourself, to accept your brokenness, and to live with a responsibility in the world for kind of managing these issues on a daily and a weekly and on just a constant basis. And it really inspired me. It really changed me. But that was the beginning of my interest in this issue. Along the way, I met a number of I had a number of doctors who overdosed, and I started working on overdoses. Around the time of 2010, when the Affordable Care Act passed, the work kind of shifted for me a little bit. And in addition to the work with doctors, I started working with addiction treatment programs. And the whole world changed for addiction treatment and mental health when the Affordable Care Act passed. There was all of a sudden insurance money and massive growth. But with that, this issue of overdoses in treatment programs, in treatment facilities, became a huge issue. And I started working around the country, and I developed this bizarre specialty in helping treatment programs that had overdoses actually deal with them. And I found myself not in the normal role of a lawyer, of writing contracts and resolving disputes, but of writing talking points for how to talk to families who had lost children, and how to talk to staff and to fellow residents when someone had overdosed and died in a treatment program. The work, I started to feel like, on the one hand, I was glad I knew a lot about it, and I'm proud of some of the work of helping programs reduce and eliminate the problem. But it also just left me feeling like I had to do more than just do that work for a living. It made me feel a responsibility to start saying something more broadly. And that was kind of what precipitated this work. So that was sort of the origin of it. And then this one last piece of kind of the origin of the work, Rabbi Gamer mentioned, in 2017, I decided to write a book. It was right after President Trump was elected. I had a lot of people calling me nervous what was going to happen to the Affordable Care Act. And so I decided with a colleague to write a book from Obamacare to Trump Care. And what we started off, our goal in writing that book was just to say to everybody, don't panic. The Affordable Care Act he made some changes that are going to stick, and I think were borne out these years later. There are some things where the Affordable Care Act failed, right? We just wanted to call balls and strikes and be fair and stop the demonization of it and present what was an alternative view for different reforms that the Republicans, if you took them, if you took Paul Ryan at face value, were offering. And we just wanted to sort of offer a picture of what was wrong. And what I came away with from the book was the sense that however you slice it, we have a broken healthcare system, right? We spend, when I wrote the book, it was about $8,200. Now it's over $10,000 per man, woman, and child, double what any other developed country spends. And yet we have terrible health outcomes. And that is what you can take it a lot of different ways, but it's relevant to this issue because we're great at late stage intervention, right? We're great at delivering Narcan to stop an overdose at the last minute, but we're terrible at preventive care. We're terrible at addressing non-clinical lifestyle issues, things like education, social support, housing, and diet, what people call social determinants of care that drive health outcomes in a massive way. And so I came out of that book with that sense. And then I was trying to write a follow-up to that. And I found I couldn't get my mind out of the subject of overdoses and addiction, which is what led to this book. So let me tell you what I think, what I wanted to say about it and what I tried to say in the book. First of all, we talk about an opioid epidemic, and I'm not a believer that we should be focusing on either just opioids or just overdoses. We are in a moment in time that I believe is better characterized as syndemic, meaning multiple concurrent overlapping epidemics that are all interacting with each other and making each other worse. And in this case, there's an issue of addiction. We have 1 in 12 Americans who self-identifies as having misused drugs in the last 12 months. A huge problem of chronic pain, right? 1 in 12 Americans saying that chronic pain is limiting their daily activity, work and life activity, most days or every day. 1 in 5 Americans complaining of chronic pain in the last 6 months, and mental health, right? And so for me, overdose deaths are just, they're an indicator that tie to these issues, right? They are a canary in the coal mine. So my goal in writing the book was to try to offer a more thoughtful understanding. I as much as it's true that there were bad doctors, my experience was that the problem was not, this problem wasn't defined by Dr. Feelgood, by doctors not knowing how to prescribe. That may have been a small piece of it. We have work to do on training physicians, and there's a lot to say of that. That's a whole topic by itself for another night. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family were bad actors, but that doesn't help us get to a deeper understanding of what's really going on. What I saw, the more I started reading and doing some research, was that we had a massive pendulum swing from the early 20th century, where, you know, in 1899, Bayer put heroin out as a product that you could buy without a prescription in a drugstore, right? By 10 years later, there was an international convention and a massive crackdown, and there was a generation of doctors in the 1920s that lost their licenses. In many cases, went to jail for enabling patients to get opioid medications simply to stop them from going through withdrawal, right? And we went through a period from the 30s to the 60s where we really made it hard for people to get pain medication, and things changed radically again in the 70s and 80s as we woke up. A new generation of doctors woke up to the problem of pain, and we started seeing pressure on doctors by the 90s to start prescribing, right? Medicare, the Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals, started pressuring doctors and hospitals to survey patients on pain, which led to more pain being prescribed. So there's a big historical story that underlied this, and I wanted to tell that. But more importantly, I was frustrated because I found that the conversations around these topics are siloed, right? That we don't ever sit and look at what's happening. There tends to be a very separated conversation about this issue, and if you start paying attention to a lot of the media coverage, it's very narrow and focused on singular topics, which makes for better stories for journalists, but like tells us less about what's really going on. And I found the coverage kind of binary and reductive. And I found a reluctance to examine root causes. I just want to share a story on this to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. But basically, I was invited around the time I wrote the book, I connected with some senior people who were working on opioid issues at the Center for Disease Control. And they were excited that I was saying things that they agreed with, but that they weren't allowed to say in their roles. And they invited me to a policy conference. And I'm sitting at the table with all these heads of federal agencies and a lobbyist from a number of the lead agencies. And they wanted to put out a white paper that our names were going to be attached to. And the topics were getting Narcan, the overdose reversal drug, into as many places as possible, schools and law enforcement. And that's a great thing. The conversation was around, needle exchanges to stop the spread of HIV and hepatitis. And that's a great thing. The conversation was about spreading medication-assisted treatment. It was great. But at one point in this discussion, this day-long conversation, I said, can we talk about the linkage between mental health and addiction that isn't being addressed? And the president of the AMA at that point, Patrice Harris, said to me, Harry, when you raise the topic of how addiction and mental health are interconnected, you're asking not only the people in this room, but the legislators who are going to have to address these issues to boil the ocean, right? The response was, you're making the problem too big and too deep, and if we can't offer measurable, solutions that have a positive result by the next election cycle, it's not, we don't want to touch it, right? It's not that you're not raising a true issue. It's just we can't do anything about it. And I was a little bit, I came away sort of discouraged by the sort of limits of what we can do in our political process. And that's leaving aside the polarization and all the other dysfunction, again, a topic for another day, that really stops us from solving almost any problem. In this area, there's agreement that we need to do something, but the only thing that we can do are these baby steps. And this is not a problem that calls for baby steps. So let's turn to the kind of my core message in the book, which I want to share. It's been, the last 20 years have been an awakening to this crisis. It is what I call a slow moving mass casualty event. The numbers, if you look at them, would be as if, you know, a 747, a couple 747s a day were crashing and people were dying. That the death rate, right, was below 10,000 in 1999. It was 11,000 in 2000. It was 33,000 by 2015. Last year it was, depending on whose numbers you use, 95,000 to 100,000. 2021 was clearly 107,000. The numbers are going up and up. And so this issue has been getting worse and worse. And yet, because it's slow moving, it doesn't capture the headlines, right? In 2018, there was actually a celebration declared by the administration that the numbers went down, which I want to talk about. And it was like a little blip that was misunderstood. And so we had this celebration. We finally gotten the numbers down. What the pandemic showed us is that the problem is accelerating and getting much, much worse. The overdose death rate is not getting better. I said a couple minutes ago, I don't like to talk about just opioids, because when you actually start looking at the data, I put up a slide that to me is a huge story that has not been really taken in fully, which is a University of Pittsburgh study in 2018 pointed to the fact that if you go back to the late 70s and early 80s, you see the beginning of a year over year more overdose deaths than the year before, right? A linear exponential curve of rising overdose deaths every year, which predates opioids. We kind of track the opioid crisis to 1997 when Purdue Pharma came out with OxyContin. So it doesn't conveniently fit in the opioid story if we start the story 20 years earlier, right? I think it says something about what's happening in America that we need to be focusing on. And it's not just an opioid problem, and it doesn't help us to make the story about opioids. I think it teaches us that there is a market efficiency between the people who supply drugs and the people who are looking for drugs. And that market will, if law enforcement, you know, stop a certain drug, and they get really good at stopping prescription grade pharmaceuticals from making it into the out there, then what happens? The drug seeking public move to readily available street drugs. Today we've gone from pharmaceutical grade OxyContin and Percocet and pharmaceutical grade fentanyl to this awful concoction that's being shipped in precursor chemicals from China and from Asia, coming into the southern border and coming across as being cooked in Mexico, increasingly being cooked in the southern United States, and it's this incredible market efficiency. If you start looking at that, and if we do something about this, another pathway will open. And so I'm not somebody who supports a lot of effort into interdiction. That's not where we're going to solve this crisis. It's a push down here, pop up there phenomenon, a little bit like that old game whack-a-mole that you would play at Cedar Point or at an arcade. That's really the problem we've got here. And we should be really, this is yet another reason to really look at underlying causes and not drug-specific problems. In terms of part of what bothered me was, if you start looking at what's going on, there's plenty of blame to go to US drug manufacturers who manufacture these opioids. And I'm not an apologist for them. The ones who are paying these large amounts to settle cases, they engaged in bad behavior when they promoted these drugs, when they didn't warn people about the problems with these drugs, but they were just one of many points of failure, right? Our insurance system has a strong preference for pills because pills are cheaper than paying for people to go see mental health professionals, than paying people to go see chiropractors and physical therapists and to deal with pain in other ways. Pills are a solution that our system prefers. So we don't look at that, right? We could hold our government agencies responsible, like the FDA, the DEA, Medicare all had a role to play in this. And so it's not this whole idea of blame. I grew up in a house where we did occasionally have fun blaming, blame storming, figuring out who was really responsible. We have a 45-year debate over a jar of peanut butter in our house and who was responsible for sticking their finger in it. But so I'm all for blame storming in certain contexts, but in this context, it drives me bananas, right? We have a lot of deep problems, right? Like, as I said at the beginning, we have a system that's really good in America. America is the best place in the world to be treated for cancer but it's the worst place in the world to try to get preventative care. Again, longer conversation, hard to get into, but that's part of the story. And there is a deep cultural issue about Americans and pain that's here. So it's a really complex issue. So I mentioned in 2018 there was this brief moment of celebration that the numbers went down from 97 to 98. When you start looking at the overdose crisis, even within just looking at only at opioids, like the slide that I put up, what you see is that it's never one drug, right? It's a series of drugs. So what this slide shows is that there's the line that is at the top at the very far left of the slide that kind of rises gradually and then flattens, but is prescription drugs, right? That we kind of identified that by the early 2000s, and it still went up, but it was not the real problem. There's a line in the middle, another dotted line that rises, that goes up like where that second arrow is, if you can see that. That's heroin, right? So for a while, as the DEA got really good at cracking down on the prescription grade drugs that were coming out of pharmacies and doctors' offices, heroin started to fill the void. And by the way, not one kind of heroin. We had one kind of heroin in Appalachia. We had like black tar heroin. That was a brown heroin. We had black tar heroin. There's a whole market out there of people coming up with drugs to feed the American appetite for drugs. And then we have that black solid line, which is almost vertical on the far right of the slide, and that is fentanyl. And what happened in 2018, where those lines were sort of converging, is that the numbers went down because the fentanyl crisis was just in its early beginning, and so we were actually doing better with limiting prescription drugs, which, if you're somebody who suffers from chronic pain, is not doing better. There are people. There's a problem, a whole sub-problem of suicides from people who did not get access to prescription drugs because of chronic pain. But if you're looking at this from the standpoint of overdose deaths, the numbers went down for like blip because we were controlling the prescription drug supply, and the fentanyl crisis was just beginning. 4 years later, we can see that it was just a blip, and that fentanyl is accelerating, even as a new wave of polydrug, of stimulants, of MDMA and meth is out there also killing people on the streets of America. So this whole thing is really constantly in flux. It goes to that point about the market, and it also raises a very troubling problem, which is, more people are dying from the counterfeit fentanyl, the garbage that's coming into the country, who actually would be alive if we made a choice to give the people who are addicted access. I'm not up here making that argument. I'm just saying there's a lot of contradictions and a lot of problems. But I want to kind of shift to what do we actually do about it. So if you want to start thinking about this crisis, you have to ask what's causing it. And it's a hard question to ask because there's a lot going on. You have some people who are experiencing significant biological pain and using it medically and getting addicted, right? If you watch the movie Dope Sick, that's the story that's being told, and it's a true story. But there's also an enormous amount of people who are getting into this for other kinds of pain, for psychosocial pain, for spiritual pain, and I'll come back to that, because of stress, right? And are misusing the drugs. And there's a whole, in our younger generation, we have a whole younger generation who are using the drugs recreationally, and that's a whole nother pathway leading into overdoses. By the way, as much as I talk about overdoses, I just included this slide because it's for every overdose, right? You have 10 people who, for every overdose death, you have 10 people who went into treatment admission. You have a lot of people who are overdosing and then coming back out. I had a client who was he was an addiction treatment marketer who got arrested for doing something getting paid for bringing patients to a facility, which at a time when he didn't even realize it was not something that was legal to do, but he did it. He went and he got out of he got sentenced. He didn't actually go to jail. He called me. I hadn't talked to him for like a year. I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, and he has had 10 overdoses in the last year. This is like a 30-year-old guy. And so for every single death, there are these people who are just cycling through and having overdoses month after month. And then there are all the people who are being treated, all the people who are continuing to abuse and misuse. It's an ocean, right? It's not just an ocean of people struggling and in pain. It's also this parallel problem of mental health disorders, right? If you look at, and by the way, this isn't the only issue to look at. There's a book that I think is compelling to read called Deaths of Despair, which talks about alcohol deaths, which talks about suicides. And these are all reflections of, I think, of a much deeper problem that I want to come to. And so we have these parallel rises in mental health and anxiety. By the way, after the pandemic, a lot of the data showed that anxiety and depression reported in the United States went up by 25% after the pandemic, which means that it's not just that addiction and overdose deaths accelerated. Every problem, this whole group of problems accelerated. And you start to ask about the common roots of trauma, certainly lack of treatment in our healthcare system, but really, and just an enormous amount of trauma in America. Just to talk for a second about the pandemic, I just want to be mindful of time, not forgetting that I'm speaking at Beth Shalom. The impact of the pandemic. So the impact of the pandemic, the acceleration in the overdose death rate from 2019 to 2020 was 30, depending on what state you lived in, was 30 to 60% across the whole country. It was definitely worse in sub-communities. Tomorrow I'll talk a little bit, I want to talk about Jewish community, but when you look at who's really dying, communities of color, in Florida, the African-American community had over 100% overdose death rate increase in 2020, right? The soaring incidence of mental health issues, particularly focused on young people, disproportionately, increasingly affecting communities of color. And it's just the pandemic has really, as much as the pandemic sort of led to less coverage of this issue, it made all of these issues, mental health, overdoses, and pain, so much worse. So I said to you, part of what I was trying to do with the book was to really address this on 3 levels. There's a lot of things that need to be happening now and that are happening, right? The good news is that we are getting the overdose reversal drug, Narcan, out there, and that is helping at the last minute. If you catch people while they're still breathing, you can reverse opioid overdoses, right? Access to treatment drugs like naltrexone and buprenorphine, that's drugs like Suboxone and Subutex, Sublocade, that's a really positive thing. There are more forms of treatment available. We are doing a lot more to expand access to treatment. But I view those things in the immediate category. The things that really we need to be thinking about are both systemic and long-term. Systemic, meaning one of what I tried to argue in this book, one of the big things was we just need a lot more outreach and education, right? The famous television ad for my generation was Nancy Reagan's campaign, Just Say No. We really need to be thinking about a lot more about what we're teaching children, which is how to think about the underlying drivers, right? We need to think about how do we raise more resilient, not just people who are afraid of drugs, but people who are resilient, right? We have a lot of work to do on health professional education. We're seeing recovery support is getting, the good news is it's happening. We're getting more support to keep people, when you can catch people, when people survive drug use, to get support for recovery community is increasing dramatically. We're seeing huge advancements in therapeutics. I've been privileged to do a lot of work around psilocybin and ketamine and other therapeutics around medical devices that are doing more neuromodulation to deal with pain issues. There's a lot of exciting innovation out there. We need a lot more access to behavioral health. One of the things that's been exciting for me has been there's a whole new model coming, which you're going to start to see in the coming years, of behavioral health urgent cares, which are urgent care centers that are not for the broken arm or for the, for your fever, but urgent cares that are there for, to deal with people who need a medication that, and are experiencing, they don't want to be hospitalized. A lot of people are afraid of using our hospital system around mental health issues, but just creating points where we can start to route people to get much more immediate and short-term access in an urgent care model. We're starting to see the police working much more hand in hand with those kind of models instead of incarcerating people. So there's a lot of good things happening. But the question that really bothers me is that we aren't talking about how do we reduce demand in the long term. By the way, I included a slide here just on sort of what the CDC is calling for now, and it's a lot of what I just described, right? Better coordination between healthcare, law enforcement, mental health, more community resources, more screening, and that's all good. But what I want to close with is just a few thoughts on how do we look deeper at this, right? We definitely, without question, are in massive need of more resources for people in pain, for people addicted, for people struggling with mental health. But what I wanted to offer is what I've come to, and I say this not with any clinical experience and not as a researcher, but just having spent a lot of time in close proximity and talking to a lot of different people about these issues, is I have come to believe that this whole crisis, ultimately, if we want to talk about what's happening, we have to look at a convergence of a deep despair and hopelessness that's out there, a real sense of isolation, and then pain being this third driver of these three dimensions, right? It's really that when these three things come together, that people are giving up, and that people are either deliberately taking drugs or committing suicide, or accidentally, or putting themselves in situations where they don't mind, where they're willing to be reckless about it. And I think that our answer comes from how we address those issues. I think there's a few different ways to look at it, and I'm not going to have as much time as I would like to spend on these, but I want to just use our last 7 or 8 minutes just to sort of share a couple theories of what's going on. This is one that I become a believer in. There's a whole bunch of, there's a whole socio-political school of thought that if you look at the success of liberalism in the last 50 years, like we became a free society, right? We freed people from the shackles of needing to be part of an organized religion, from needing to be married, from needing to be part of communities. We made enormous progress on freedom, and we became the freest country in the world at the price of being the most miserable generation in history, right? And eroding the social support that came with that, right? You have books like Bowling Alone from Putnam, Why Liberalism Failed, and there's been this pendulum swing that we've had from living our lives in community to living our lives individually. And part of what really speaks to me about addressing this issue is that we need to find ways not to become a more repressive society. I'm not arguing, please don't tell people you came to hear me and I told you that we need more repression, social repression, but we need to find ways to rebuild community. We have to recognize that we've lived in the last 5 years, 50 years. And by the way, it's 50 years since my parents came to, this coming summer will be 50 years since I came here as a 4-year-old. In that 50 years, we went from a community, a country that lived its life in community, to a country where we're all living increasingly individual lives, and we've eroded our social support for the people who are, and that's the reason for the isolation. The hopelessness is a longer conversation. There's also this, I mentioned the book Deaths of Despair, which is a socioeconomic analysis, right? That when you look at where the problem is worst, which is in the working class, which is in working class men whose jobs have disappeared across America, that's eroded communities, it's eroded a sense of purpose and self-worth, and that is really a driver of this crisis, and it's very persuasive. It's a very persuasive work. It led me to this to this idea, and I'm going to talk more about this in a Jewish context tomorrow. I like to use these 4 C's, which my friend Brian Portnoy came up with in his book Geometry of Wealth, which is the 4 things that really sustain us and really drive human happiness are connection to others, right? The opposite of isolation, having a sense of purpose, the opposite of despair, having a sense of of control in your own life, a sense of autonomy, which is, I think we are living in a time when people truly feel that they are victims of present circumstance, and a time of, and the last of the four C's, competence, meaning being of service to others. And I think that's part of the broken culture in America, that we don't have those things. So there's a lot more to say here. There's another approach that we could take to this, and I'm going to just shortcut it in the. If you want to know more about this, there's an approach to thinking about this as a series of attentional disorders in America that we have that's yet another framework to think about it. But I want to just leave you with a few closing thoughts. I think that one of the things that we're not hearing enough and I particularly, one of the reasons it's meaningful for me to speak to in a religious community with so many people who I grew up with and who I know through as part of a religious community is that we don't talk a lot about the extent to which pain, stress, and wellness have social, emotional, and spiritual dimensions. One of the things I want to talk about tomorrow is some of the exciting things that are happening in religious life that we as a Jewish community could be learning from. So that's an important message for me out of this work. Another is that lack of community, just to put it, the point I was making a minute ago, lack of community is really what's putting vulnerable people at risk, because it's that isolation piece, right? The hope, purpose, it's not easy. Talking about purpose and why people are so in despair, if I could rattle off like 10 headlines right now and you would agree with me, whether it was climate change or Ukraine or the state of the country and the state of our politics, but isolation is much more addressable. So lack of community is what's putting people at risk. One of the real lessons for me is that shame is part of what's leading towards stopping people from asking for help. In the course of writing the book, I interviewed many parents whose children, some of them survived overdoses and were in recovery from addiction, others who did not. And there was this consistent theme of people feeling ashamed, right? That we're living in a time when kids feel like they're the only one in their school or in their class who's dealing with this issue, and we have to strip away the shame from that's stopping people from reaching out for help. In parallel to this, I really think we live in a culture where there's this binary model of you're either well or you're mentally ill, and we need to end that and really start to think of all of ourselves as living on a continuum where whether you have developed coping skills, whether your mechanism for dealing with those moments when you're feeling down is reaching out to a circle of friends and family who are social support, or whether you're somebody who needs professional intervention, we have to think about this as one continuum and eliminate the sense of shame and stigma around it. We have so much opportunity, and this is where I really am hopeful, is that if we turn towards making ourselves present, making ourselves vulnerable for people around us, I think that I don't think this is just a story that has to be as bleak as the one that we're seeing play out. I've been really blessed to be working with a organization called Project Opioid that has been working on community partnership solutions. I sort of stumbled in, I didn't know when I wrote the book that what I was writing was an argument for using community partnership as a model of change, of social change, but really that's where I think there is hope, is that if we bring together stakeholders, if we can do this on a personal level in our immediate communities, but there's also an opportunity for this to be an issue where we bring together faith communities, schools, employers. The workplace is such a huge opportunity to address these issues alongside the people who've already been engaged in it, of law enforcement, of health systems, recovery community. I think there is hope, and I think that we can find solutions there. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it on a Jewish level, but I'm going to stop here, and I want to thank you all so much for I hope this has given you something to think about, and I'm delighted. I've included my information, would love to continue the conversation. Yeah. Great to see you. I hadn't heard specifically that. So that kind of requirement of training of,
Not only was required, the thing is you couldn't maintain your license.
that's amazing. So so Michigan was very progressive in that respect.
This is like 9-10 years ago. Hold on, I'm doing something wrong here. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay, it works. My question to you, being on the road in terms of research, what do you know about the rest of the states in the country in terms of them requiring CME in order to maintain their licenses?
I want to say Michigan is one of only, I don't have the exact number, but I want to say 10, maybe 10 states have that requirement. At least 40 states do not have that requirement.
But you knew about this, right?
Yeah, I followed this issue, and physician training is a huge issue. You're far ahead of where we are in California, I can tell you.
Okay, as a matter of fact, and I'm proud to say it, my daughter's a psychiatrist, and she was 7 years ago one of the first people speaking on CME and addiction because she was a psychiatrist and was dealing with the childhood addiction and stuff like that. So
Perfect.
thank you. I
Thank you.
appreciate that.
Questions?
First, I wanted to just say how proud I am of you always, but thank you for coming and sharing a very important messages. And we're going to continue the questions, but I do want you to also tell them that you just got invited to teach a class at.
Yeah, no, so I've had a great, California on a state level is a mess compared to Michigan in terms of physician training and physician regulation. But I was invited by USC to teach a medical school course on public policy and pain last year. And this coming year, I'm actually very excited. I'm working with an anesthesiologist to do an undergrad course. USC, by the way, it pains me to say nice things about USC as a Wolverine, but they're doing it. They have an incredible. They built a whole undergrad curriculum because of a demand from students to understand pain, and they're putting together these pieces of the medical and a broader story about pain. And I'm excited. I'm actually just started working on a curriculum for this course that's going to start this fall. One of like 8 courses that they're starting on the topic.
Harry, great talk. You finished, briefly talking about community engagement, and I'm just wondering if you have any examples of where that's, maybe taking place or being put to work.
So I mean, there's a lot. First of all, it looks different in a lot of different places, right? So by the way, like we're seeing some large companies that are actually responding to these issues. Ernst & Young had a campaign, "How are you?" Right? Just getting people to understand that it was really important to check in with coworkers and really making it a priority in their company to ask the question, "How are you?" Right? That's an example of corporate engagement that's very impressive that every company should be doing, because the warning signs start for people who are in the workforce with changes in people's behavior. Right? People so just another example of community engagement. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about like what we could be doing in Jewish community. And by the way, I was very impressed. I went on the Jewish Addiction Resources for Michigan, and there are great community resources. But one of the lessons I've learned, like going into Saddleback, one of the big mega churches in Southern California, is there's a lot of slices of this, right? It's not one thing, and the people a lot of different cohorts. And so when you show up there, they're like, what groups do you want to take part in? And it would take a lot more organization across synagogues and across other community organizations, but we could be doing more to just when people show up at our doors there, and if you show up there, you are handed something, and you are basically, they ask, "Who are you? And are you interested in participating?" And it goes through everything from addiction. Are you looking for a 12-step group, which is a great beginning, but also like, are you suffering from pain, chronic pain in a medical context? Are you grieving, right? And there are literally 40 choices. I think I have it on one of my slides tomorrow. So that's another example. And I think it looks really different if we're talking, depending on the institution that we're talking about. But those are a couple examples that really speak to me.
With all of the discussion right now about the problems of gun control, and really the discussion is at state and national level is really coming around to a consensus only around things like mental health. Are there people that are lobbying and trying to keep this the talks about mental health more than just profiling potential assailants, but mental health that would incorporate this as part of what we might be had a moment of freeing up some funding.
So you're asking a super interesting question. By the way, I don't know if anyone else listens to the podcast, The Daily. I'm like from the New York Times. I'm religious about it. And they republished something this morning that talks about gun violence and these mass shooter events and mental health. And what they said is that by our current, this actually ties to my point about mental health. They said this researcher said that about 4% of all mass shooter events are actually people who we define as mentally ill. The vast majority are people who don't meet our current mental health criteria because they're just like rageful, young men who feel a sense of real entitlement and are angry, and they're not mentally ill by our current definition, which tells me my reaction to the story is we're thinking way too narrowly about what mental health is. And we have this really scary phenomenon of people whose reaction, a lot of my talk tonight was about people whose reaction to our present circumstance was anxiety and depression, but a lot of people are full of rage about it. And I think it's a massive problem that is very much a part of this story, but it doesn't work as a mental health story if your definition of mental health is like, you have to meet these narrow clinical criteria. If you start taking a more expansive view of where we have mental health issues to deal with and start thinking about how we engage them, then I think there's something that we could talk about and put resources on. I highly recommend listening to this the podcast that it comes out every morning. Yeah.
You mentioned studies of pain, and I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because the thing about pain is that if you're hurting, I can't see it. It's not like, you're bleeding. So how do you know that it's real? I mean, it's sort of like quantum physics. You can't see it, but it's there. How do you know? Is there a way that we can find out, and before we start treating or while we're treating?
So you're asking a really hard question, and I'm not qualified as a clinician to say, but I'll tell you what struck me. First of all, what's striking is the numbers on pain are different than the numbers in the rest of the world, both how pain is reported, how much people report pain, and how we treat it, right? And I do think this speaks to something in American culture. There's a book that I mentioned, I talk about in my book, where it was somebody from a European author, journalist, who went around and he complained. He had a legitimate like shoulder injury that had been bothering him for 20 years, and he went across Europe, and the responses were, it's tough, you have to deal with it, stretch every morning and the pain will be better. And then he came to America and he was invariably offered shoulder surgery, injections and and pain medications. And it said something, the book is fascinating because it reflects a profoundly different culture on what expectations we have for dealing with pain. But the pain is, to me, the challenge is, I think there's a deep problem in American culture that leads us to, that's leading to this higher reporting. But the reality is we're dealing with 1 in 5 American adults, 250 million Americans complaining of chronic pain being a problem in their lives in the last 6 months, of whom 1 in 12 says it's a daily or almost daily occurrence, limiting their life activity. So we have this problem that we're a nation that is uniquely sort of sensitive to pain and really hungry for immediate solutions to the pain-free solutions, not to be make a pun, but we're also it's real. So I don't have a good answer, but it's a hard question you're asking.
Questions, anyone we've missed?
Do you feel there's a connection, maybe even a relatively direct connection, with the increasing mass killings, everything going up like this, psychotically, and the drug issues, that the underlying issues are really...
So the question, so the question was, is there a connection? Do I believe there's a connection between the mass shootings? And so I believe it without question. One of the slides that I put up and then took down was about this whole theory. One of the theories is one of attentional disorders. And the basic idea that comes out of a kind of narrative medical approach is that we all as human beings, right, we experience these things. We experience these different states in our lives. Like we experience anger, that's a natural human emotion. But and the theory is that just as when you experience loss and you feel grief and sadness and you don't process it, and that's not to take away from genetic whatever predispositions, but that there is an aspect of in which grief, depression is in part a result to a sort of processing disorder where you just can't stop thinking about something, so you're sensitized towards it and it amplifies for you, and your body actually undergoes physical and chemical changes because of mind-body connection, and that leads to depression. So too, I believe, anger and this unprocessed anger that people are fixated on, are sensitized to, becomes amplified, and I absolutely believe that the same thing that leads one person into a place in their lives where they're taking their own life. I don't see how we don't make a connection between the fact that some people's response is to take their own lives or to do things that put themselves at risk, and this other group is directing it outward and taking it out on other people. And I think that's if we don't, I think that's an important piece of this. I've already been accused of trying to boil the ocean, so I shy away from saying it, but I totally believe it. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for, and I look forward to talking more with you all about this.
So first of all, thank you to Harry. Wow. Wow. I can tell you that there's always a lot of risk when you invite a guest, because if they bomb, then everybody looks at you and says, what were you thinking? So as Harry explained, there was risk in standing here where he had watched his father talk for years. Imagine from our end, what if he would have bombed and then everybody would say, well, why did you think that was a good idea? But I think it was a wow. So lots of thank yous, lots of thank yous. The person who should be acknowledged, and it is larger than life in what we've put together, is Shira Shapiro, to whom we don't say thank you enough for all the little things that she does, for the 10 calls a day that I got. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on? Is there anything else that needs to be done before the program? So we certainly want to say thank you to Shira. To Dan Barth, thank you for a lovely welcome. To Rabbi Gamer for the introduction, and to the organizations, some of whom actually have tables in the other room. I hope you'll stop by and hear them talk about specifically what they're doing to address the kinds of things that Harry has talked about, and to the Jewish News, which must be acknowledged because they are the agency that connects us all, that puts the information out there for us to read and learn about, whether it's in print or online. And to the volunteers who made time tonight, absolutely, we're grateful that you said yes. As anyone knows who's ever planned anything, when you call and say, will you, and the person says yes, you say, thank you, God. So I say thank you to all the volunteers who said yes. And to our sponsors whose names are on your program, a special thank you, because obviously nothing happens for free. And you can have a great idea. If it isn't funded, it doesn't happen. So we say thank you to all our sponsors. To Jara, I hope that you will be there representing JFS with their program, and then you'll get to hear a lot about that. To Tri Community Coalition, to the IRP, the Maimonides Society, which is the Jewish Community Federation, the medical group, and to all of you who are here from Beth Shalom. So we welcome you. We thank you. We hope you will join us inside. There are books for sale. They are on the table. Obviously, if you want to read, go back and review some of what Harry said, because he talked really fast. You can take it home, digest it. We always have an argument at home because our children constantly, they're very sweet and they're very complimentary to us, but we look at each other and we say, oh my God, did you hear what she said? That was amazing. So much insight and so much understanding. And did you hear what he said? Oh my God. Do you believe his grasp of things and how he puts it together? And so we always have who is to blame. And I always say, well, thank God they got their father's brain. So at least he got my organization. anyway, we thank all of you. We hope you've enjoyed. We hope you've learned. We hope that Harry's presentation, which was amazing, has opened some possibility of new thought on some of the issues that we're all dealing with. And we hope you'll enjoy the cake and cookies that's in the other room.
You can kiss the sneaker.
It was great. It was great. Okay, it was amazing.
Thank
Oh, now, when people buy books, you'll.
Yeah, of
sign
course,
them.
yeah,
Okay. Good. Okay. Yeah. And- Oh.